History often tells a story, but not the whole story. When we think about slavery in America, images of cruel white male slaveholders usually come to mind. We remember the brutality, the chains, the auctions, but one critical aspect of this dark history has been almost completely overlooked: the role of white women as perpetrators of abuse against black male slaves. For centuries, historians and society alike operated under the assumption that women were too weak, too delicate, too emotional to commit serious crimes, let alone use sexual power as a means of control. This assumption allowed a significant part of the story to remain hidden, shaping our understanding of slavery in incomplete and misleading ways. But the truth is far more complex. White women were not merely passive observers or innocent bystanders in the system of slavery. They were active participants. They bought and sold enslaved people, managed households and plantations, and, in many cases, wielded power over those in their control in ways that have been historically ignored. And for black male slaves, the consequences could be devastating. Some were targeted, coerced, and exploited, enduring both physical and psychological abuse that left lasting scars. Why have these stories been silenced for so long? Part of it comes down to societal perceptions of gender. The idea that men cannot be victims of sexual exploitation, combined with the myth of the virtuous and delicate Southern woman, created a historical blind spot. Documented evidence, however, paints a different picture. Autobiographies of former slaves, court records, and historical research reveal patterns of coercion, manipulation, and abuse that challenge the conventional narrative. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and race, and to reconsider the ways we understand oppression. In this video, we will explore these hidden histories. We will uncover real-life accounts of black male slaves who suffered under the hands of white women, examine the social and economic structures that enabled such abuse, and reveal how these narratives were deliberately suppressed to maintain a certain image of white femininity. By shedding light on this overlooked aspect of history, we honor the voices of those who were silenced and gain a more complete understanding of the complexities of slavery. So if you are ready to confront a side of history that has been hidden for too long, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with friends who care about uncovering the truth, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more stories that challenge what you thought you knew. Together, we can explore history in a way that is honest, engaging, and empowering. Stay tuned, because what you are about to learn will challenge your assumptions, open your eyes, and remind us all that history is never as simple as it seems. In the shadowed corridors of antebellum plantations, a reality persisted that has often been left out of the broader narratives of slavery, one that speaks to the intersections of race, gender, and power in ways that remain uncomfortable yet essential to confront. While the brutality inflicted by male slaveholders has been documented extensively, there exists a lesser-known, deeply troubling pattern involving white women and the exploitation of light-skinned male slaves. These young men, often the product of prior mixed-race unions, found themselves in a precarious and perilous position, not only as property in the eyes of the law but also as objects of desire, manipulation, and coercion. Their lighter complexion, which in other contexts might have been considered an advantage, tragically marked them for heightened scrutiny and unwanted attention from white women seeking to assert control in ways that went beyond social convention and societal expectation. Accounts from the period reveal the chilling nature of this exploitation. Autobiographies, court records, and the testimonies of abolitionists paint a vivid, if disturbing, picture. Young men chained or confined within the household, ever at the mercy of the whims and desires of the women who wielded authority over them. These were not instances of fleeting interactions or inconsequential acts. They were systematic, sustained, and often meticulously documented by observers who recognized the harm but were constrained by the social norms of their time. One such account describes a young male slave kept near the bedside of his mistress' father, chained and partially clothed, with every day carefully monitored to ensure compliance and submission. The mechanisms of control were not only physical but psychological, embedding a sense of perpetual vulnerability and eroding any semblance of autonomy these men might have possessed. Historians such as Thomas Foster have meticulously chronicled these abuses, demonstrating that the sexual exploitation of male slaves was neither anomalous nor isolated. It included coercion, forced intimacy, manipulations intended to enforce obedience, and in many cases, compelled reproduction. White women, endowed with a combination of social privilege, economic power, and racial authority, were able to operate within a system that protected them from scrutiny while leaving their victims exposed to profound trauma. The abuses these men endured often extended into their most private spaces, invading not only their bodies but also their sense of identity and agency. For these light-skinned slaves, their appearance, which might have otherwise signaled proximity to whiteness and potential favor, was twisted into a tool of vulnerability, drawing attention in ways that subjected them to repeated exploitation and control. The social and cultural context of the time only intensified these dynamics. Southern society had codified rigid hierarchies that placed white women in positions of both moral reverence and practical authority, creating a paradoxical environment in which their actions could be both celebrated and feared. Women of considerable wealth and status wielded economic power through their ownership and management of enslaved people, and this authority extended into the domestic sphere, where their oversight was absolute. Light-skinned male slaves, often singled out for their perceived beauty, became instruments through which white women could exercise this authority, a power that sometimes included bending or breaking the social taboos surrounding sexual behavior. The very privileges that allowed white women to act with impunity also rendered the male slaves uniquely vulnerable, caught in a system where escape from caution was nearly impossible and resistance carried the threat of punishment or reprisal. Embedded within these abuses were layers of psychological complexity and subtlety that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Coercion was not always overt. It could manifest as manipulation, expectation, or pressure to conform to desires that were carefully framed as acts of benevolence. Attention or affection. The light-skinned male slave might be promised favor, protection, or a better position within the household, only to find that compliance was the price of safety. The social constructions of race and gender intertwined to create a landscape where the power imbalance was total. The white woman's social standing insulated her from consequence, while the male slave's lack of legal and social protection magnified his exposure to harm. Even the language used in the period, whether in autobiographies or legal depositions, reveals the calculated obscurity that surrounded these abuses. Writers often employed euphemism, metaphor, or veiled description, reflecting both the constraints of polite society and the attempt to preserve the dignity of the victims in the written record. Yet, beneath these layers of coded language, the patterns are unmistakable. The targeting of light-skinned male slaves was deliberate, systematic, and embedded in the structures of plantation life. Historians, by piecing together court records, personal memoirs, and testimonies, reveal a tapestry of exploitation that had long been obscured, demonstrating the ways in which racialized and gendered power could be wielded to devastating effect. The implications of this history reach far beyond individual stories. The targeting of light-skinned male slaves by white women underscores the intersection of race, gender, and authority in shaping experiences of slavery. It challenges simplified narratives that cast women solely as victims of patriarchy or men as invulnerable, illustrating instead a complex web of social forces in which power, desire, and systemic oppression intersected in deeply personal and often hidden ways. These accounts reveal a painful but necessary truth: that slavery was not only a system of economic exploitation but also a structure that facilitated abuse, manipulation, and coercion in multiple, often invisible, dimensions. Understanding this dimension of history requires a careful and empathetic reading of the sources, recognizing both the courage of those who recorded their experiences and the systematic efforts to silence them. Light-skinned male slaves, caught at the intersection of race and gendered power, endured profound violations that extended beyond physical abuse, shaping their lives and their communities in ways that resonate long after the formal end of slavery. By examining these histories, we gain a more complete understanding of the complexity and cruelty of the institution of slavery, as well as the resilience and fortitude of those who endured it. The stories preserved in historical records and autobiographies, such as those recounted by Harriet Jacobs, offer a window into a side of slavery that has often been left in the shadows, one that intertwines fear, power, and a haunting intimacy of control. Male slaves, particularly those with lighter skin, were frequently subjected to circumstances that left them little room for agency. Their bodies and minds coerced into compliance in ways both subtle and overt. Jacobs herself, writing from the vantage point of a survivor, described conditions that revealed the extent to which enslaved men were treated not as human beings with autonomy, but as objects through which the authority of white women could be asserted and maintained. These accounts are not merely anecdotal. They are corroborated by multiple sources, including court records, testimonies collected by abolitionist commissions, and other contemporary writings, all converging on the reality that the institution of slavery allowed, and in many cases facilitated, the exploitation of male slaves for purposes that transcended conventional labor. On plantations across the South, the mechanisms of control were engineered with precision, often beginning in the domestic sphere where the male slave's life was closely monitored and regimented. Some were confined to the rooms of white women, their movements restricted by physical restraints, their clothing minimized to ensure compliance, and their daily routines dictated by the whims of those in power. Psychological manipulation accompanied these physical measures, creating a persistent state of vulnerability and dependence. In many cases, promises of favor, safety, or protection were used as instruments of control, with the ever-present threat of punishment or social ostracization reinforcing the boundaries of obedience. Male slaves were expected to navigate these dynamics with an understanding that resistance could result in severe consequences. Yet submission did not guarantee relief from exploitation, leaving them trapped in a cycle of fear and coerced service. These experiences were compounded by the social context in which they occurred. White women occupied a paradoxical position of reverence and authority, their actions often shielded from scrutiny by the cultural assumption of feminine virtue and delicacy. This veneer of respectability masked a capacity for enforcing power in ways that were simultaneously domestic, social, and sexual, allowing them to exercise control that could be both overtly coercive and subtly manipulative. The targeting of male slaves was often deliberate, informed by notions of racial hierarchy, aesthetic preference, and personal desire, creating situations in which the victim's appearances, particularly lighter skin, marked them for increased attention and heightened risk. Historical records show that the abuse was not random. Patterns emerged, revealing systemic behaviors that reflected the intersection of racial and gendered power structures, where male slaves were subjected to exploitation as a means of asserting social dominance. Harriet Jacobs' accounts are particularly poignant because they convey the psychological dimensions of this exploitation, the mental strain endured by enslaved men under constant surveillance, expectation, and coercion shaped their interactions, identities, and survival strategies. Jacobs and other autobiographers revealed how enslaved men were forced into intimate acts, not simply for gratification, but as a method of reinforcing authority, exerting control over their bodies and undermining their autonomy. The narratives also expose the complex moral landscape in which these abuses occurred. White women could simultaneously be constrained by societal norms and exercise power within those constraints, while male slaves had to navigate a reality where personal safety, bodily integrity, and social positioning were perpetually at risk. The tension between compliance and resistance, fear and survival, creates a narrative of endurance that resonates across these records, highlighting the intricate web of oppression that structured everyday life for enslaved men. Testimonies collected by abolitionists and official inquiries further reinforce the prevalence of these abuses. Depositions describe young men forced into proximity with white women, compelled to serve in ways that were humiliating and controlling, and subjected to punishment if they resisted. One narrative recounts a slave ordered to attend to a woman's personal needs in ways that included intimate contact, with refusal resulting in physical punishment or social censure, illustrating the dual mechanisms of coercion that combined fear and forced service. These reports, when considered alongside autobiographical accounts, underscore the consistency of the experiences, demonstrating that these forms of exploitation were neither isolated nor accidental but were woven into the very fabric of the institution of slavery. The exploitation extended beyond physical coercion into the realm of psychological manipulation, shaping the behavior and self-perception of male slaves over time. Compliance became a survival strategy, and understanding the motives and desires of those in power was crucial to navigating life under slavery. The subtle strategies employed by white women, whether through promises, intimidation, or the orchestration of circumstances that forced proximity and interaction, created a persistent state of tension and uncertainty for the male slaves, eroding personal autonomy and instilling a lasting sense of vulnerability. These dynamics, meticulously documented by historians and chronicled in first-hand accounts, illuminate the interplay between race, gender, and power, revealing how systemic oppression could be exercised through both the body and the mind. The narratives also highlight the courage of those who endured and survived such conditions, as well as the resilience required to preserve their stories. By recording these experiences, male slaves and sympathetic observers challenged the social norms that sought to erase or minimize their suffering, providing contemporary historians with the evidence necessary to reconstruct this hidden aspect of slavery. These records allow us to understand the breadth and depth of the abuses, illustrating that exploitation was not confined to labor alone, but extended into intimate and personal dimensions of life, mediated by power dynamics that were both overt and insidious. Ultimately, these accounts compel us to confront a more complete understanding of slavery, one that recognizes the agency and culpability of white women as well as the vulnerability of black male slaves. They reveal the complex intersection of societal structures, gendered assumptions, and racial hierarchies, showing how personal desire, social standing, and institutionalized power converge to create situations of profound and enduring harm. By engaging with these narratives, we gain not only insight into the mechanics of oppression, but also a deeper appreciation for the resilience, endurance, and humanity of those who lived under such conditions, ensuring that their stories are neither forgotten nor simplified, but understood in the full complexity of their historical reality. Evidence of the sexual exploitation of male slaves by white women is not confined to anecdotal recollections or isolated narratives. It is corroborated through a range of historical records that collectively reveal the systemic nature of these abuses and the social mechanisms that both enabled and concealed them. Court documents, particularly divorce filings in the antebellum South, provide some of the most startling and detailed insights into these dynamics. In many cases, white husbands petitioned for divorce not solely on grounds of infidelity in the abstract, but specifically because their wives had engaged in relationships with enslaved men under their control, revealing an implicit recognition of both the sexual agency of the women and the subjugated position of the men involved. These filings, often framed in the legalistic and moral language of the period, inadvertently illuminate the profound imbalance of power, where the male slave was rendered both vulnerable and invisible, a property whose autonomy was entirely secondary to the desires of the white women who exercised control over him. The documentation of these petitions demonstrates that sexual exploitation was not a matter of rumor or conjecture. It was visible enough to enter legal proceedings, providing historians with concrete evidence of behavior that had long been obscured by social conventions and gendered assumptions. In addition to divorce records, the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, established during the Civil War, collected extensive testimonies from formerly enslaved people and those who had observed their treatment. The Commission's mission was to provide the federal government with a comprehensive understanding of slavery's social, economic, and moral consequences, but the testimonies it gathered reveal much more. Depositions describe young men coerced into intimate contact with white women, sometimes under threat of punishment or social censure, and forced into conditions designed to elicit obedience while asserting the woman's authority. The meticulous detail with which these testimonies recount such experiences indicates that the behaviors were neither exceptional nor hidden from all observers. Rather, they were normalized within the plantation household, occurring under the vigilant eyes of the enslavers' community while remaining largely invisible to the broader society, because acknowledging them would have contradicted prevailing notions of white female virtue. Abolitionist accounts further corroborate these abuses, offering testimony from those committed to documenting the injustices of slavery and advocating for its end. Abolitionists like Captain Richard G. Hinton traveled extensively, gathering stories from formerly enslaved men who recounted being compelled to comply with sexual advances or directives from white women in positions of authority. These narratives reveal the psychological complexity of the exploitation. Compliance was not always achieved through overt physical coercion alone, but often through a combination of expectation, intimidation, and manipulation, creating a climate in which resistance carried the risk of punishment or social marginalization. The abolitionists' records highlight a deliberate pattern, showing that white women were not passive participants in the institution of slavery but active agents capable of exercising power over male slaves in ways that were socially sanctioned, yet personally devastating. The interplay of legal, governmental, and activist documentation paints a picture of systemic abuse, where the vulnerabilities of male slaves were exploited in a variety of contexts. Light-skinned male slaves, in particular, were frequently singled out, their appearances positioning them as objects of attention and desire while also marking them for increased surveillance and control. Court records and testimonies describe situations in which these men were deliberately placed in the proximity of white women, with their lives regulated to ensure availability and obedience. Physical restraints, close monitoring, and controlled living conditions were paired with psychological tactics such as promises of protection or reward, reinforcing the enslaved men's dependence and limiting opportunities for resistance. Within this web of coercion, the male slave's autonomy was systematically eroded, leaving him vulnerable to repeated abuse that was both physical and psychological in nature. What emerges from these historical documents is a pattern of behavior that challenges conventional assumptions about gender and power in the antebellum South. The long-standing belief that women were incapable of committing serious abuses is dismantled by records showing that white women could, and did, use sexual exploitation as a tool of control. The intersection of race, gender, and social status allowed them to operate with impunity. Their actions were shielded by societal assumptions of feminine virtue, while the men who were targeted had little recourse. The records of divorce proceedings, government commissions, and abolitionist investigations collectively provide a body of evidence demonstrating that these abuses were neither isolated incidents nor anomalies, but part of a broader system in which power could be exercised through sexualized authority. These historical documents also reveal the ways in which such abuses were concealed, both intentionally and through societal norms. Testimonies were often veiled in language designed to protect the reputations of the women involved. Using euphemisms, coded references, or moralistic framing that obscured the severity of the acts. Male slaves' own voices were frequently marginalized, their suffering minimized in public discourse to preserve an image of white femininity that was culturally idealized. Despite these obstacles, the surviving records, autobiographies, court filings, commission testimonies, and abolitionist accounts provide compelling evidence that challenges sanitized narratives of the past. They illuminate the lived reality of male slaves, showing how coercion, manipulation, and abuse were embedded into the social structures of the plantation household and the broader institution of slavery. By examining these diverse sources together, a more complete and nuanced understanding of slavery emerges. The exploitation of male slaves by white women was not a series of aberrations, but a structural component of a system designed to assert and maintain power, both socially and economically. It underscores the complex ways in which gender, race, and authority intersected to create conditions of extreme vulnerability, revealing the depth and breadth of the harms endured by enslaved men. These historical records challenge us to reconsider the narratives we inherit, compelling us to recognize both the agency of those who wielded power and the resilience of those who survived, ensuring that the stories of exploitation, coercion, and endurance are neither forgotten nor oversimplified. In the antebellum South, the image of white women as passive figures confined to the domestic sphere has long dominated popular imagination. But historical evidence tells a much more complex and unsettling story. White women were not merely bystanders in the institution of slavery. They were active participants whose involvement shaped the social and economic landscapes of their communities and extended into the intimate lives of those they enslaved. From a young age, girls in slave-holding households were introduced to the management of human property, often receiving enslaved individuals as gifts and learning the skills required to supervise labor, enforce discipline, and navigate the legal and social frameworks that underpinned slavery. By the time they reached adulthood, many of these women were not only familiar with the mechanics of buying and selling enslaved people, but were also adept at wielding the social and economic authority that such ownership conferred. Ownership of enslaved people provided more than labor. It offered status, influence, and, in many cases, enhanced marriage prospects. The number of enslaved people a woman controlled could elevate her social standing within her community, signaling wealth, competence, and the capacity to manage complex household and agricultural operations. This translated directly into power within her family and community, granting her a level of autonomy that was exceptional in a society that otherwise restricted women's legal and economic rights. Historical records show that women exercised this authority in multiple ways: negotiating sales and purchases, enforcing discipline, and actively participating in the management of plantations, sometimes rivaling or exceeding the influence of their male counterparts. Through these actions, they not only maintained their economic interests, but also reinforced the social hierarchies that privileged whiteness and gendered authority simultaneously. The economic significance of enslaved people in the lives of white women was intertwined with personal and familial ambitions. Families often bequeathed enslaved people to daughters as part of their inheritance, equipping them with both wealth and a means to secure advantageous marriages. In some cases, the number of enslaved people a young woman controlled could determine her desirability as a bride, making her an asset not only economically but socially. The intersection of property, marriage, and social status underscores how deeply entwined the institution of slavery was with the identity and agency of white women, providing them with leverage that extended beyond the domestic realm and into the broader economic and political fabric of the South. This authority, however, was not abstract. It manifested in very tangible and often harrowing ways for those under their control. Light-skinned male slaves, for example, were frequently targeted because their appearances made them particularly visible and desirable to women who could act with little fear of societal repercussions. Enslaved men were confined, coerced, and manipulated to fulfill both domestic and personal desires, and their vulnerability was exacerbated by the legal and social systems that recognized the property rights of white women while offering no protection for those they enslaved. The abuses and exploitation, whether economic, physical, or sexual, were facilitated by the very ownership and authority that women exercised, creating a power dynamic in which survival depended on navigating the complex whims of their overseers. The ways in which women exercised this authority were varied and calculated. They oversaw work assignments, monitored compliance, and enforced punishments, often involving both physical discipline and psychological manipulation. They also participated in the market itself, buying and selling enslaved people as both economic assets and instruments of social strategy. Some white women orchestrated marriages, familial separations, or transfers to different households to consolidate power or manipulate social connections, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both human and economic capital. These actions reveal that female slaveholders were not merely caretakers or administrators. They were strategic actors, navigating and manipulating the systems around them to maintain wealth, status, and influence, often at the profound expense of the enslaved individuals whose lives were treated as commodities. Historical accounts further illustrate that this involvement was not limited to adults. Girls growing up in these households were socialized into a system of control and domination from a very young age. They observed and participated in the disciplining of enslaved people, learning early that power was exercised through a combination of authority, oversight, and the strategic use of privilege. By the time they assumed full control as adult women, they were not only familiar with these systems, but were also adept at exploiting them to maximize their social and economic position. This continuity between childhood exposure and adult authority underscores the intentionality behind female participation in slavery, challenging the notion that women's engagement was incidental or passive. The consequences of women's ownership extended beyond the immediate household. By actively engaging in the buying, selling, and management of enslaved people, white women reinforced and perpetuated the broader structures of slavery, shaping social norms and economic practices across the South. Their decisions impacted entire communities, influencing labor practices, social hierarchies, and the distribution of wealth and power. Ownership conferred a degree of agency that allowed women to navigate a society otherwise restricted by patriarchal norms. But it also enabled acts of control and exploitation that were deeply harmful to those whose lives were commodified and regulated. Examining these dynamics in historical context reveals a more nuanced and troubling understanding of power in the antebellum South. White women's ownership and management of enslaved people were not passive responsibilities. They were active exercises of authority with profound implications. Through their engagement in the economic and social structures of slavery, they shaped the lives of those under their control, maintained and enhanced their own status, and participated fully in a system that intertwined gender, race, and power in ways that were deliberate and consequential. By acknowledging this, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of slavery and the ways in which power was exercised not only through men but also through women whose authority and influence were both pervasive and enduring. On plantations across the antebellum South, the upbringing of young white girls was carefully structured to ensure that the next generation of women would not only inherit wealth and property, but also the skills and authority necessary to manage enslaved people and sustain the deeply entrenched system of oppression. From the earliest years, girls were introduced to the workings of the household and the plantation, observing the labor of enslaved people and learning to administer discipline, monitor productivity, and enforce social hierarchies. These lessons were often framed as part of a proper upbringing, cultivating traits of responsibility, order, and moral authority. Yet beneath the veneer of refinement and education lay an initiation into the exercise of power over human lives. By the time they reached adolescence, these girls were not merely spectators of a system built on exploitation. They were active participants in its perpetuation, trained in both the management of labor and the subtle, sometimes brutal, methods of asserting control. The training these young girls received was both practical and psychological. They were taught to supervise work schedules, to allocate tasks, and to ensure that enslaved people adhered to expectations without deviation, often using methods that included physical punishment or public humiliation. Historical accounts collected from former slaves indicate that children, sometimes even preadolescents, were encouraged or at times required to administer beatings or enforce compliance, learning early that authority could be exercised through coercion and intimidation. The lessons were reinforced by the adults around them, who modeled behaviors that linked wealth, race, and gender with control, teaching that the proper use of power involved both overseeing labor and asserting dominance in ways that kept enslaved people in a state of subordination. In this way, childhood education was inseparable from the mechanisms of systemic oppression, preparing these girls to become women capable of maintaining and extending the structures of slavery. The exposure to management and discipline was not merely a matter of household organization, but was intertwined with social and economic strategy. Families often bequeathed enslaved people to daughters as part of their inheritance, creating a direct link between property ownership and social status. Girls learned that the number and quality of enslaved individuals under their care could enhance their desirability as future wives. Signaling wealth, competence, and social standing. This early association between property management, social positioning, and personal advancement reinforced the notion that authority over enslaved people was both a right and a responsibility. Deeply embedded in the cultural norms of the plantation elite, it also demonstrated that the control they exercised was not only practical but symbolic, reflecting and sustaining the racial and gender hierarchies of their society. Accounts from formerly enslaved people provide vivid insight into how these lessons were enacted. Some recalled being forced to interact with young girls in supervisory roles, experiencing discipline and oversight from children who had been trained to enforce compliance with the same seriousness as adults. The combination of authority, youth, and the socialization of control created an environment in which resistance carried heightened risk, as even the next generation of girls was prepared to exercise power and enforce obedience. The psychological impact of this training was significant, instilling early lessons in domination and submission that would shape relationships between enslaved people and the women who oversaw them for decades to come. The preparation of young girls for roles as managers of enslaved people also encompassed a social education, teaching them to navigate the norms, expectations, and privileges of their class. They learned the rituals of plantation life, including formal interactions, displays of refinement, and the management of households as centers of both social and economic influence. Yet these lessons were inseparable from the practices that sustained slavery, the allocation of labor, enforcement of rules, and, in many cases, the orchestration of punishment or humiliation. Historical research shows that this exposure began extremely early, sometimes in infancy or early childhood, as girls were assigned small tasks that introduced them to the principles of oversight, accountability, and the hierarchical ordering of people according to race and status. Over time, these small responsibilities expanded, embedding a sense of entitlement and authority that became second nature as they matured into adulthood. This training was not limited to domestic management but extended into the realm of personal and sexual authority, shaping how white women would later navigate the complex power dynamics of the plantation household. Light-skinned male slaves, for instance, were often singled out for special attention, vulnerability, or exploitation, and girls raised within this system absorbed the lessons that proximity to whiteness and social privilege could be leveraged to exert control in ways both overt and subtle. The combination of early socialization, exposure to property management, and intimate knowledge of household hierarchies equipped these young women to navigate relationships with both the enslaved population and the wider community, reinforcing patterns of dominance and submission that were central to the institution of slavery. The consequences of this upbringing extended far beyond the individual households in which girls were raised. By socializing the next generation of women into the norms and practices of slavery, families ensured the continuity of a system that relied on both labor exploitation and psychological control. Young girls were inculcated with a sense of entitlement and responsibility that tied their personal identity to the ownership and management of human property, reinforcing social hierarchies and perpetuating racial and gendered inequalities across the South. The deliberate instruction they received how to oversee labor, administer punishment, and navigate social expectations was an essential component of the structural perpetuation of slavery, ensuring that the authority of white women would endure through successive generations. Understanding the upbringing of these girls provides critical insight into the mechanisms by which slavery was maintained and normalized. It reveals that the exercise of power was not confined to adult men or formal institutions, but was cultivated from childhood through deliberate education and socialization, shaping the attitudes, behaviors, and authority of women who would one day command significant influence over enslaved populations. By examining these processes, we can better grasp the ways in which oppression was both systemic and generational, embedded in social practices, family structures, and early education, creating a cycle of control that would persist until the formal abolition of slavery and leave lasting legacies in the social and cultural memory of the South. The formal abolition of slavery in the United States did not immediately dismantle the entrenched power structures that governed the lives of enslaved people for centuries, and in many cases, white women who had exercised authority over enslaved populations sought to preserve their dominance through alternative means. Across the South, as Union troops advanced and the 13th Amendment formally ended slavery, formerly enslaved people found themselves navigating a world in which legal freedom coexisted with pervasive social and economic constraints designed to limit the practical exercise of that freedom. White women, who had long managed households, labor, and property, including human property, adapted to these changes by employing coercive labor contracts and exploitative arrangements that mimicked the control they had previously wielded under the institution of slavery. These contracts, often framed as voluntary agreements, were in practice highly restrictive, binding workers to conditions that closely resembled servitude, and ensuring that white women could maintain economic advantage and social authority even in a post-emancipation context. Historical accounts reveal the persistence of this behavior and the lengths to which some women went to enforce it. Martha Gibbs, for example, moved formerly enslaved individuals to Texas, compelling them to work for her at gunpoint well after the formal end of slavery. illustrating both the determination to retain labor and the ability to manipulate social circumstances to exert control. Others drafted contracts that limited mobility, dictated wages, or imposed severe penalties for noncompliance, creating systems in which the autonomy of freed people was severely constrained. These measures demonstrate that the abolition of slavery did not automatically translate into freedom in practice. For many, the transition from enslavement to economic independence was obstructed by the same individuals who had previously held them in bondage, now operating within the framework of ostensibly legal arrangements that perpetuated inequality and dependence. The motivation behind these efforts was multifaceted. Ownership of enslaved people had long been tied to social status, wealth, and personal identity for white women in the South, and the sudden removal of that institution threatened both their economic security and their societal position. By crafting labor contracts that mirrored elements of slavery through control of living conditions, work assignments, and personal behavior, women could maintain a sense of authority and preserve their status within the community. This continuity of control reflects not only an attachment to material wealth, but also the deep socialization into hierarchical and racialized norms that had been instilled from childhood, shaping their understanding of power, entitlement, and societal order. It was not merely economic expedience that drove these practices, but a deeply ingrained ideology that equated social dominance with control over labor, particularly the labor of black people, and that rationalized coercion as both acceptable and necessary for the maintenance of social order. The consequences of these post-emancipation strategies were profound for those subjected to them. Freed people, though legally independent, often encountered conditions that left them economically vulnerable and socially constrained, limiting opportunities for mobility and self-determination. The contracts imposed strict work schedules, regulated personal behavior, and sometimes replicated hierarchical living arrangements reminiscent of the plantation era, reinforcing psychological and social pressures that maintained de facto subordination. These arrangements illustrate the adaptability of oppression, showing how structures of dominance can survive legal reform when societal attitudes, economic incentives, and entrenched power intersect to create conditions in which freedom is heavily circumscribed. Formerly enslaved men and women had to navigate not only the residual authority of white women, but also a broader system in which racial prejudice, economic dependency, and social expectation continued to constrain their lives long after emancipation. Historical documents, personal narratives, and contemporary analysis converge to highlight the persistence of these practices and their implications. The legacies of coerced labor and restricted freedom reveal that the end of slavery was not an endpoint for systemic oppression, but rather a transformation of the mechanisms by which it was enforced. Women who had been trained from childhood to manage and control enslaved populations adapted their authority to the new social and legal realities, employing legal contracts, intimidation, and social leverage to sustain their influence. In some cases, this included orchestrating labor arrangements that limited the mobility of freed people, regulated wages and living conditions, and effectively reproduced elements of the hierarchy that had defined plantation life. By doing, they maintained a degree of social dominance that was rooted not only in property and wealth, but also in the cultural and psychological norms that had long positioned white women as figures of authority and control. This post-emancipation adaptation also illuminates the intersection of ideology and material interest. While some women may have claimed moral or sentimental reasons for their insistence on controlling labor, the economic benefits of such arrangements were undeniable. Maintaining access to cheap, controlled labor ensured continued prosperity, while enforcing hierarchical relationships reinforced social prestige and affirmed long-standing racial and gender norms. In essence, The post-slavery period became a continuation of the social education and power structures established during childhood and adolescence, where girls had been trained to exercise authority and manage human property, now translated into legally sanctioned methods for retaining influence over the lives of formerly enslaved people. The persistence of these coercive practices underscores the resilience of institutionalized power, showing how deeply embedded hierarchies of race and gender could survive profound legal and social change. By analyzing the strategies employed by white women after emancipation, historians can trace the continuity of exploitation, highlighting the ways in which authority was exercised, adapted, and maintained even in the absence of formal slavery. These narratives also provide insight into the lived experience of freed people, who confronted a new legal reality that offered formal freedom, but did not necessarily guarantee the ability to escape the entrenched social, economic, and psychological constraints imposed by those who had formerly held them in bondage. Ultimately, the post-emancipation period illustrates the enduring consequences of power and socialization, revealing how deeply ingrained systems of control persisted beyond the abolition of slavery. White women who had been trained from childhood to manage, discipline, and exercise authority over enslaved people leveraged both legal mechanisms and social influence to maintain economic advantage and social dominance, creating a new framework of coercion that, while different in form, perpetuated many of the same hierarchies and vulnerabilities that had defined the plantation era. By understanding these dynamics, we gain a fuller appreciation for the complexities of emancipation and the continuing struggle for genuine freedom, autonomy, and social justice in the wake of centuries of systemic oppression. Despite the layers of oppression and concealment surrounding the experiences of black male slaves, a remarkable testament to human resilience and courage emerges through the fragments of narratives and records that have survived the centuries. Many stories of abuse perpetrated by white women were deliberately obscured, edited, or omitted from public accounts, largely because acknowledging them would have challenged the prevailing social ideals of white femininity, propriety, and virtue. The public image of the refined, moral, and gentle Southern lady was carefully maintained, even as countless men and women suffered under the systemic exploitation that these women actively participated in. In many cases, the very act of documenting abuse was an act of defiance, an assertion of truth in the face of social and cultural forces determined to suppress it. Autobiographies such as those by Harriet Jacobs, testimonies collected by abolitionists, and the legal records that inadvertently captured instances of coercion and manipulation stand as enduring evidence that the lived reality of slavery was far more complex and harrowing than conventional accounts suggest. These surviving records reveal not only the abuse itself, but also the remarkable ways in which black male slaves resisted and preserved their humanity under conditions specifically designed to strip them of it, even when subjected to coercion, forced labor, and psychological manipulation. These men found ways to assert agency through small acts of defiance, the careful navigation of power dynamics, and the preservation of their dignity in private or communal spaces. Some resisted the demands placed upon them by withholding compliance when possible, finding subtle means to protect themselves from the worst forms of exploitation, or seeking solace and support among peers and within the enslaved community. The documentation of these acts of resistance reminds us that, even in circumstances of extreme vulnerability, individuals maintained a sense of self and an awareness of justice that transcended the constraints imposed upon them. The suppression of these stories was not only a reflection of societal discomfort with the notion that women could commit acts of abuse, but also a strategic mechanism for maintaining social and economic hierarchies. By keeping such narratives hidden, the broader society preserved the myth of benevolent white womanhood and redirected attention toward the actions of white men as the sole enforcers of oppression. However, the persistence of these narratives, even in partial or coded forms, has allowed historians and scholars to reconstruct aspects of this hidden history, bringing into focus the experiences of those who were most marginalized and whose suffering had been deliberately rendered invisible. Each testimony, deposition, and autobiographical account contributes to a collective understanding that recognizes the multifaceted nature of power, exploitation, and resistance during slavery. The resilience of black male slaves, documented through their narratives and those of sympathetic observers, is a powerful reminder of human endurance and the capacity to maintain identity in the face of systematic dehumanization. These stories illuminate the strength required to survive not only the physical and sexual abuses, but also the psychological pressures designed to instill fear, obedience, and resignation. Many men cultivated networks of support and solidarity within the enslaved community, sharing strategies for survival, cautionary tales, and moments of emotional support that allowed them to withstand daily indignities. Even when their voices were marginalized in official records, the traces they left behind through oral histories, autobiographies, or the careful testimonies recorded by abolitionists provide compelling evidence of courage, resourcefulness, and a refusal to be wholly subdued by the mechanisms of oppression. The survival and preservation of these narratives underscore the importance of historical inquiry that centers the experiences of the oppressed rather than those in power. By examining the stories of black male slaves who endured sexual, physical, and psychological exploitation at the hands of white women, we gain a richer and more accurate understanding of the institution of slavery and the complex interplay of race, gender, and power. The willingness of some individuals to document, testify, or recount their experiences, despite the risks involved, represents a profound act of resistance that challenges sanitized historical accounts and ensures that the realities of abuse are not erased from collective memory. It is through these accounts that modern audiences can begin to grasp the full scope of slavery's human impact, acknowledging the suffering endured while also celebrating the resilience that allowed so many to survive, endure, and bear witness. As we reflect on these stories, it is essential to recognize both the tragedy and the resilience embedded in this history. The abuses inflicted by white women were part of a broader system designed to enforce control, perpetuate racial hierarchies, and maintain social and economic dominance. Yet, within this system, black male slaves demonstrated remarkable strength, ingenuity, and a capacity to resist, ensuring that their experiences, though often hidden or silenced, could ultimately inform our understanding of human endurance and justice. By studying these narratives, we honor those who survived and resist the temptation to overlook or simplify the complexities of history, acknowledging the courage required to navigate and endure circumstances designed to strip them of their dignity. We hope this story has illuminated a part of history that is frequently overlooked, and that it has encouraged reflection on the ways power, oppression, and resilience intersected during one of America's darkest chapters. The experiences of black male slaves who survived abuse at the hands of white women remind us of the enduring importance of preserving marginalized voices, learning from past injustices, and recognizing the capacity for resistance and resilience even under the most oppressive conditions. Thank you for watching and taking the time to engage with this important history. If you found this story enlightening, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to our channel to continue exploring untold histories and meaningful narratives that deserve to be heard. Your engagement helps ensure that these stories, and the lessons they carry, continue to reach a wider audience and inspire understanding, empathy, and awareness for generations to come.